Well, something that stood out as a highlight for me was Rule 11, where, try to make your one room in your house as beautiful as possible, because you even stipulate that cleaning your room is not everything, which I think may even come as a shock to some of the followers. And if you'll indulge me, I took that advice in the first book and in general, not only philosophically, but very practically. And what I noticed is that when I cleaned my room, so to speak, it ended up being very empty, just out of being hyper organized and getting rid of clutter. So I think, you raised this point about art that is so important. Do you feel that, especially conservatives seem to have a vacuum when it comes to interest in art and literature? If you're someone who is conscientious, how can you overcome that? Can you overcome that? Can you overcome your sort of rigid nature if you are someone who's conscientious?
Okay, so that's rule 8, right? Try to make one room in your home as beautiful as possible. And it was partly put in the second book as a extension of clean up your room before you attempt to clean up the world. And you discussed your adoption of that philosophically as well as practically. And I don't think that those two things are really different, at least it's at one important level of analysis. Um, it's a philosophical act to put your room in order, not least because you have to decide what to keep and what to eliminate, and you have to decide where to put everything and why. And so your room is saturated with value decisions, and every value decision is a reflection, at least, of your implicit philosophical hierarchy, and hopefully to some degree of your explicit philosophical hierarchy. And because it's that hierarchy, implicit and explicit, that determines your value decisions. So you can't clean up your room without doing it philosophically. Now, you might not be able to state explicitly why you made all the decisions that you did, although you might be able to state some of them. And so I noticed in my clinical practice, and this is one of the real strengths of the behavioral approach. I'm very interested in psychoanalytic thinking, but with most of my clients, I never did symbolic therapy, let's say. I didn't do dream analysis. We didn't pursue the meaning of meta narratives. With some of them, I did, but those would have been the more creative people. And they were interested in that sort of thing. And they were also likely to fantasize, to read fiction, and to have a very active dream life. But with many of my clients, and this was also in some sense independent of their intellectual ability, that was just a non-starter. And I noticed that when I was teaching too. Some people ate up the mythological / symbolic material, and some people were much more attracted to the bare bones practical behavioral approach. And I always started with my clients with the behavioral approach. Do something, change something that you're acting out. Okay, so let's say you put your room in order. Well, that's good, but you said yourself, well, your room was kind of bare once you made it efficient. And efficiency and charm have an uneasy relationship with one another, and so do efficiency and beauty. If you think about them as informed by conscientiousness and openness, they're actually somewhat separate, right? Because the 5 dimensions of personality are pretty independent, not entirely. Like extroversion and openness clump together, and agreeableness, conscientiousness, and emotional stability clump together. The first 2 would be plasticity, exploration, and the second would be something like stability. But you asked if you could be conscientious and have an eye for beauty, and you certainly can. You can be conscientious and open. That's somewhat less likely because it doesn't matter. That it's certainly it's a temperamental it's a form of temperament that definitely exists. That would confuse you politically because your conscientiousness would tilt you towards a conservative and traditional outlook, but your openness would tilt you towards more radical, revolutionary, and more liberal ideas. And then there'd be an additional influence of trait agreeableness, whereas so that breaks down into compassion and politeness. And if you're compassionate, you tend to tilt more towards the liberal end of things. And if you're polite, you tend to tilt more towards the conservative end of things. So now, so I would say you can be conscientious and love art. It might be, and I don't know this, and I don't think anybody's ever done the research. I suspect that conscientious people who love art likely like art that's more structured.
So
Maybe
not
they're not so
abstract.
much in. Some abstract is very structured. Mondrian, for example, it's all rectangles and cubes and lines, unbelievably carefully done. Maybe you wouldn't like abstract expressionism, which tends to be more emotive and also more messy in a technical sense, visual sense. If you're low in openness, can you develop an aesthetic sensibility? And I would say with difficulty, you're pushing against your temperament. You might be able to convince yourself that there's something there that's of value that you don't understand. And maybe if you can see glimmerings of aesthetic interest, you might develop it. And then you could put some effort into it too and see what happens. I mean, I'll give you an example. I bought these paintings for my father about 15 years ago, and they were Russian Impressionist paintings, which I thought were of very high quality. The Russian Impressionism is a lot rougher than French Impressionism. It's not as pretty. The brush strokes are rougher and harsher. My father really liked the paintings, and my mother didn't like them at all. In fact, she wouldn't let him hang them in the upstairs of our house. So they stayed in the basement for a while, but he got nice frames for them, and then he put one up, and then he put a bunch of them up, and now she doesn't even remember disliking them. She really likes them. So, and she's more conservative. She's conscientious and lower in openness. And so for her, art is quite shocking to her. It has too much of an impact. And she used to come over to my house, which was completely covered with paintings. And I mean completely. Every square inch had a painting on it, even the ceiling. And she said, I just can't understand why anyone would want to live in a museum. And I would think, well, that's exactly where I want to live. But that's a minority taste. Who knows how much you can teach yourself in a direction that's antithetical to your personality? You can certainly teach yourself some. I've seen agreeable people learn to stand up for themselves. I've seen disagreeable people learn to be more empathetic and centered on others. That does happen more and more as you age. And so I think, your temperament in some sense is the talents that you were born with, or the proclivities that you were born with. God only knows how much will can move that, will and practice. But you have to build it from the bottom up, and it's effortful. I've seen very unconscientious people become conscientious as well by will.
If you like that video and want to see more, please make sure to subscribe to the Post Millennial. For daily news and content, please go to thepostmillennial.com and consider becoming a member. For $5 a month, you can get rid of all the advertisements on the site. If you like what I'm wearing on my head, you can go to shop.postmillennial.com, where we have beanies, mugs, and t-shirts. Please consider supporting the Post Millennial however you can. It's massively appreciated. Thank you.